that the last time we did this, every member of the DC Circuit.
We can go into this, but...
So I'm just going to change the subject of
General, I'm sorry.
Justice Kagan, thank you.
Because there are many former members of the DC Circuit.
I'm going back to it.
Okay. I'd like to hear about the merits of this case. I want to come back to some of the claims that both sets of respondents here have in common, dealing with what we've called the arbitrary and capricious aspects of the case. And as I understand it, the memorandum really talks about two things. It talks about forbearance, and it talks about sort of economic/COVID conditions. Forbearance as a kind of separate thing, that people who have been granted forbearance for long periods of time are more likely to go into default or become delinquent in their payments. And I guess I wonder, is that about COVID, or is that just about something that happens when you excuse loan payments for a long period of time, and how it is that that gets to be converted into an emergency COVID rationale? And then on the economic considerations, and I think it was Justice Barrett who talked about this a little, it seems, a real mixture of COVID and non-COVID related things. And of course, this is how the economy works, that COVID interacts with other features of the economy to produce certain economic conditions. But again, I'm wondering whether, there was more of an obligation on the part of the Secretary to isolate how COVID was affecting these borrowers.
Of course, and I'll take each of those considerations in turn. I'll start with your questions about forbearance, and I want to be really clear, because I think my friends have confused the issue about this a little bit, that the Secretary wasn't finding that forbearance itself had caused the economic harm to borrowers, or that it was the root cause of why they needed additional relief. Instead, the Secretary analyzed the historical data regarding forbearance as a data point in understanding that forbearance is not always a complete solution to the underlying economic harm caused by the national emergency. So here, there's no doubt that forbearance has provided very powerful and critical support to borrowers over the life of the COVID pandemic. But the Secretary found that once forbearance policy lifts, millions and millions of borrowers are going to be worse off with respect to their ability to pay because of COVID. The forbearance policy hasn't fixed the underlying economic harm of the pandemic and the emergency. So to the extent that there's a bootstrapping concern here, I just want to push back forcefully on that. I think that the Secretary's decision memorandum makes clear that sometimes additional relief is necessary, not because of forbearance, but in spite of forbearance. To turn to your question about the various causes or influences of economic harm here, it's of course true that I can't make a representation that the harms that borrowers are facing are solely due to COVID-19, but I think that it would be an impossible burden to place on the Secretary to suggest that he needs to isolate and identify just one economic factor or force that's causing that kind of distress for borrowers. Our economy is very complex, and there are often multiple factors and forces at play, but the Secretary here found, and I don't think that anyone could reasonably dispute, that but for COVID, borrowers would not be in this situation of facing severe financial harms and the very real risk that they'll have to go into default or delinquency when they start repaying their student loans. So I think to the extent that there's concern here about how the standard could operate, at the very least, the Secretary made the requisite findings that these are financial harms that derive directly from and are a but-for result of the COVID pandemic.